The Yoon administration has a host of diplomatic issues to be addressed this April, given its upcoming state visit to Washington, D.C, against a backdrop of news regarding U.S. intelligence leaks and North Korea's persistent missile launches. So what have been the ripple effects of the unauthorized disclosure of classified U.S. military documents? And is the practice of espionage to a certain extent an accepted norm, even among allies? And how should South Korea and its allies seek to better counter North Korea's missile launches and its nuclear ambitions? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address issues on the diplomatic agenda this month as President Yoon Suk Yeol looks ahead to his state visit to Washington, D.C. upon the invitation of U.S. President Joe Biden to touch upon matters of bilateral and regional interest. For more, I have Professor Kim Young-jun at the Korea National Defense University. Professor Kim, it's great to speak with you again.
Okay, nice to see you again.
I also have Professor Chung Ku-youn at Kangwon National University, live on the line as well. Professor Chung, welcome back.
Thank you for having me today.
Right, Professor Kim, we'll start with you. Let's begin with the ripple effects of U.S. intelligence leaks. Now, the presidential office here has cast doubt on the authenticity of the disclosed documents. U.S. officials, for their part, have said the documents are real, but some of them appear to have been altered. What is your assessment, Professor Kim?
Yes, everybody now talking about U.S. intelligence leaks and all CNN, BBC, all world news watching the how could be progress with this issue. So in international relations, there has been many issue and event always. This is not the first time. But this is anyway important issue for the ROK-US alliances, but at the same time, for the long term, this is just one of the issues. The more fundamental important thing is the ROK-US relation itself. Now, to countries' relation is the strongest ever, and now global comprehensive strategy, like for better opportunity to use shared information or something like that. So this is an important issue, but at the same time, the ROK-US will work together to overcome many other challenges. And next, this 2 weeks, Yoon Suk Yeol and Biden will talk about this issue for more productive outcome.
Right, hopefully, which will take place later this month during their summit talks, of course. In the meantime, Professor Chung, there is also much concern about the disclosure of a document detailing the delivery of ammunition from South Korea to an unspecified destination. Now, this follows an early disclosure of a talk between President Yoon Suk Yeol's former aides regarding South Korea's artillery shells landing in perhaps Ukraine, despite the fact that they were sold to the U.S. What are the broader implications of such revelations, Professor Chung?
Well, I think the world now understands South Korea's position about the Ukraine crisis in the first place, but we can discuss the implication over North Korea. And North Korea used to criticize U.S. directly related to North Korea in the past, but after the news that South Korea might support ammunition to the United States and possibly to Ukraine, they began to show their perspectives on Ukraine as well and try to be aligned with Russia and China. And these tactical alignments makes a kind of ripple effect in the further international affairs because these polarized situations, for instance, like might have an effect on, for instance, like voting process, the UN Security Council resolution or sanction in North Korea. And besides, South Korea's support of offensive weapons to Ukraine might serve as a justification for their support of Russia. There has been already news on North Korea sending their workforces to Russia and other military assets as well. So this kind of ripple effect might need to be considered in the future.
Right, I see. And before we progress any further, Professor Kim, there are some pundits within the academic arena here in South Korea who have suggested that espionage, even among allies, is accepted to a certain extent, but that there is always a red line to abide by. As a scholar in the field of national security yourself, do you agree?
Actually, in a real world, there is no deadline ever because of everything has happened in the international relations and in real politics. So this is not the first time, and we have a bunch of cases about German or French argument against the U.S. intelligence the Snowden or something like the cases.
Okay.
So the fundamental problem is how to solve the problem when it happened together, and also how to prevent another the unfortunate intelligence thing together. So the U.S. alliances use this case for better future, and also ironically we can use this as a better opportunity to have a more the intelligence gathering with the U.S. For the future. So now the U.S. alliance is the strongest ever. So this is a ironically golden opportunity for talking about the better intelligence relation between the country.
Right, I see. Professor Chung, staying with the subject of spying and its alleged acceptance among allies, has Washington, do you suppose, crossed the red line with regard to Seoul, do you think?
Well, I agree with Professor Kim on the point that wiretapping or espionage is possible even between allies, and everything is possible in the international affairs. But we need to confirm that to what extent and how long the U.S. has been wiretapping on South Korea, and demand those involved to be held accountable at least. But what we need to consider more is that you can see that from the intelligence leak, not all of these United States allies has been there. Especially Japan doesn't seem to be on their list among U.S. allies. Then why South Korea has been wiretapped on Ukraine issue, especially Ukraine issue, and it is integrated in that intelligence report. That's the point I think we need to consider from the incidents at this point, because it seems to reflect that United States doubts or lack of confidence on South Korea's lukewarm approach toward Ukraine, even though South Korea's Yoon Suk Yeol administration has emphasized a stance on regional security architecture that it will be more strategically clear, which has been contrasted with strategic ambiguity of the previous administrations that U.S. might perceive that it is not fully implemented. So I think we need to think a little deeper about why this issue has been wiretapped in the first place.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, President Yoon, as you mentioned earlier, is embarking on a state visit to the U.S. later this month. And the last time a South Korean leader was extended this diplomatic honor, which America reserves for its closest allies, was back in the year 2011 during the Obama administration. Now, I understand a state visit also means all expenses are paid for by the host country. And that being said, Professor Kim, some pundits claim the Biden administration may be extending this honor to the Yoon administration to perhaps set the stage for requests for some tangible concessions on certain matters. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that is possible, and everybody hope, especially South Korean. Now we can develop our relations with the U.S. as a global strategic partnership and the global people state's role in making world order and like NPT regime or climate change or something like this. So rather than the U.S. government prepare for important presidential summit between the state and this state visit will be honor for South Korea, and also President Yoon will have a speech at the Congress and Senate. So this is a special opportunity. Also, a concession is possible, especially something happened before the presidential summit. We can use this one for the more stronger alliance information gathering opportunity between the two. So this is a great symbol opportunity. State visit and ROC U.S. presidential summit will be a very important point to develop a partnership between the country.
Right. And while that is an expectation, of course, a hope that we have that they'll be able to strengthen their partnership, which will be the case, of course, under the Yoon administration. But Professor Chung, are there indeed some matters between South Korea and the U.S. that remain relatively contentious, so to speak, and that may be brought up during these summit talks later this month?
Well, of course, we can talk about U.S. CHIPS Act. As you all know, the excessive subsidy application requirements of the CHIPS and Science Act, which has been announced by the U.S. Department of Commerce, have a serious impact on domestic companies in South Korea. For instance, like among the subsidy application requirements, the requirement to allow access to the facility, which means that National Security Agency of the United States is allowed to access the semiconductor production facility in the United States. So it is highly likely that any technology will be leaked in that process. So that could be a contentious issue between two allies in the short term. But another relatively contentious issue long term could be Taiwan and Ukraine issue we might discuss later. As mentioned earlier, given the escalation in Taiwan Strait these days, it seems necessary to discuss this issue and what each allies actually want and be able to support and reciprocate. This should be discussed during this time, I guess.
Right, hopefully. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, both the Yoon and Biden administrations are on the same page regarding their policy in North Korea. Now, tomorrow, that is Saturday, Pyongyang marks the 111th anniversary of the birth of its late founder Kim Il-sung. And on April 25th, I believe, ahead of the Yoon-Biden summit, North Korea celebrates the 91st anniversary of the founding of its army. What are the prospects, Professor Kim, of further provocations by the regime in light of these events?
Yeah, now Kim Jong-un's mention about the possible provocation is getting more the aggressive, and especially she's showing some map, including Pyeongtaek, USFK base. So this is a very dangerous and possible, definitely, new provocation before, after the presidential summit, also Kim Il-sung's birthday. So ROC and U.S. military should prepare for that, and it'll be possible another missile test or another new weapon test or even cyber threat, or everything is possible, just like the drone in the past. So we need to prepare for that. And also at the same time, during the president's summit, Biden and Yoon Suk Yeol have to think about confidence building measure or something like that dialogue suggestion to the North Korea as a tension reduction approach. So we need to prepare for that. At the same time, we need to open the dialogue as well.
Right. Professor Chung, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un earlier this week vowed to bolster his nuclear arsenal in more practical and offensive ways. Do you expect a nuclear test by North Korea in the near future? And if that is the case, how should South Korea and its allies respond?
Well, I think it has been discussed for a long time that North Korea might conduct a nuclear test, but I don't think it is plausible at this moment. What we need to see is the technological advance, diversification of delivery system, as we observed yesterday with North Korea's solid fuel intercontinental missile launches. And if there is any test, not whether it is a missile or is a nuclear test, South Korean regional partners need to closely analyze the status of these provocations and share the understanding information in the first place. And trilateral cooperation need to focus on how to make North Korea's provocation more costly, as the current Yoon administration's North Korea policy focuses on dissuasion, which means it is kind of raising the cost of provocation of the North Korea. More military exercise and coordination will be followed to respond should there be any test by the North Korea.
Right. And staying with that, Professor Kim, this is an impromptu question. Do you suppose continued military training between South Korea, the U.S., and even Japan in this part of the region may only serve to aggravate tensions on the Korean peninsula? Or do you suppose these military exercises are essential to deter future provocations by North Korea?
Yeah, North Korea blamed our trilateral security partnership or even possible military exercise between the two countries, between the three countries. But nature of this exercise is fundamentally defensive, not offensive or aggressive. So this is a very important exercise to prevent any kind of war scenario, and we have to do that. So the problem is North Korean aggressiveness and also their nuclear and missile capability test. So ROC and U.S. Japan have to develop their own security partnership, but at the same time, we need to manage North Korea. This is not for the aggressiveness, but more defensive purpose.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Kim, some observers are underscoring the need for South Korea to seek to better balance its ties with its regional partners like China, especially where North Korea is concerned. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, China is always an important neighboring country and number one trading partner. And at the same time, China is a challenge to international law and order and free and open system. So our government have to stand with the U.S. and Japan, like my country, in maintaining international order, post-Second World War order, But at the same time, China is anyway too close and very important neighboring country. So we have to manage the relation between China and the ROC. At the same time, we need to reduce dependency economically on Chinese market too much. So we need to balance a view, but at the same time, we need to be a leading country in maintaining open and free world. So China is an important country, but at the same time, we need to have our own principle in maintaining ROC-Japan relation, or at the same time, China relation as well.
Right. Professor Chung, the G7 leaders are scheduled to sit down in Hiroshima next month. That would be May, and President Yoon Suk Yeol has been invited to the event where Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be taking center stage as well. What more can South Korea, do you suppose, Professor Chung, can do to promote peace within the global arena, especially keeping in mind, of course, China's current combat training around Taiwan?
Well, South Korea under the Yoon administration didn't take any visible regional action so far. While the South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy has been introduced, and it has been attempt to contribute to maintain stability of the regional orders, and that's a very important step. But what matters at this point, especially when you think about this G7 meeting, is that whether South Korea actually see these two issues, Ukraine and Taiwan issue, as a threat to global and regional security threats, which could lead to a kind of culminating point that regional order can be transformed. South Korea, whether South Korea is willing to shoulder the burden of pulling capability to prevent such a change, that should be asked during that summit, I think. And I think regional countries are already discussing this issue. So I think South Korea should ask itself whether this question and discuss regional countries about their expectations and respond in the first place. So it is kind of dialogue. They have to discuss this issue without assuming that South Korea might be a step back from this issue.
Right. And Professor Chung, staying with perhaps Korea's efforts to promote peace on the global stage, as a scholar yourself, do you suppose the Korean government, the South Korean government that would be, could perhaps do more to ensure a sort of peace or stability inside Ukraine?
Well, I think there are many options other than just sending ammunitions. We can discuss kind of post-conflict kind of stabilization operations and post-conflict rebuilding kind of process, which European countries are already doing. So that kind of things that South Korea fully capable of, I think.
I see. And Professor Kim, with regard to potential conflict, some pundits claim that in the case of an attack on Taiwan by China, South Korea would have no choice but to take a very a point of view that is on the margins, should I say. I'm really careful with the words I choose right here because it's a potential scenario that could happen or may not happen. But given that scenario, many believe that South Korea will not take a rather active stance, but perhaps a rather passive stance on that matter. Do you agree?
Fundamentally, South Korea doesn't want to engage in outside of a Korean Peninsula issue. We love peace and we want to contribute to engagement rather than military support itself. But at the same time, our important ally, US and Japan and Taiwan, have to be stand together against any kind of violation of international law and order or Chinese invasion possibility. So we need to prepare for any kind of scenario, for the worst scenario, like the Chinese or North Korea engagement. It's kind of a Taiwan crisis situation. So we need to prepare for that. But at the same time, our fundamental option is diplomatic engagement rather than military support.
Right, of course. Professor Kim, in its latest white paper disclosed on this Friday by Seoul's Unification Ministry, the ministry itself spoke about seeking for unification on the Korean Peninsula by standing up to North Korea's provocations. Do you suppose such a stance would only serve to aggravate tensions here on the peninsula?
Human rights issues always matter, and we have to think about nuclear and human rights at the same time rather than just focusing on nuclear itself. So Unification Department published the report about it, and also Unification report. This is an important gesture and two audacious initiatives is official policy of North Korea to North Korea of the Yoon administration. This is including the better practical approach to the denuclearization itself. At the same time, as a global people state, we need to absolutely contribute to the human rights issue as well. So we need to stand together with our like-minded country, including the U.S., and at the same time, we need to solve the problem, denuclearization issue. So this is a very important timing and very important publication.
Right, and staying with human rights issues as raised by Professor Kim, Professor Chung, there is a bit of talk here on the local front that the Yoon administration has been focusing quite a bit of its energy on raising better awareness about the issues of human rights up in North Korea. Do you suppose this is one strategy to perhaps rally support within those here in South Korea for the Yoon administration's future policies against North Korea?
Well, I don't think so. Human rights is a fundamental issue, and it's kind of universal human rights, and everyone is entitled to if it is a human. So I don't think it is a kind of political agenda, or it is kind of a strategy of rallying Yoon administration's supporters. I think it has been pretty long time that South Korea has been pretty remaining silent about human rights issue, and I think it's the right time to talk about human rights issue and discuss how it has been aggravated throughout the last 5 years, and discuss this issue with international community and experts.
Right, because it is a global issue, of course.
Right.
All right, Professor Chung, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Kim over in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for joining us live at this very late hour at your end.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, that ends this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend. See you next Monday.